Wonderful. Are we live? Yes. Excellent. Fantastic. All right, everyone. I'm going to try and quickly run through this a second time. You may have noticed the botched first time. We're going to try and talk about this patch note cycle. This is something I came up with a couple of other players. You saw that 2 hour, 43, 47-minute video earlier. But this is the concretized version of all of that feedback. What does it actually mean? What, instead of vague straws, do these numbers mean, and do I want them to look like? And no, we're going to break this down into a couple of sections here. I'm going to give some context to the things that you can read because you're intelligent human beings. You can see not only the patch notes, which will probably be put up on any social media sites that this video finds itself on, but also you'll have now a video to go alongside it to explain why I think that's a good idea, or at the very least, it's not a bad idea. So this didn't happen and did not have this originally, so we added in a basic concept, and here we go. The basic concept, you can see it all here. More AoE. More AoE gives more defensible bases. It also has another benefit, which is that it really punches down on tier 1 units and allows tech to matter in the game. This is important for allowing the game to go from an early game skirmish of a group of tier 1 units into a mid game that then goes into a proper end game or a late game. If you have more defensible bases, then you have more reason to spread out. So let's think about this logically. If I have, StarCraft Brood War styles Terran siege tanks, and they're really, really good at holding 2 bases, then in theory, if they're so good at stopping any attack from coming into them on 2 bases, then maybe it's really good for me to get a faster 3rd base, kind of lean on those really good AoE units. But this also makes you spread out more. And the more that you spread out, the more that harassment becomes a better tool or stronger option against you. And it rewards the micro of both players, both the person who's receiving the attack and the person who is doing the attacking themselves. It really kind of shows, much like in chess, you can see great defensive play or offensive play. So too does strong AoE kind of reward both. Also, the more powerful that AoE is, and the more powerful turtling up and holding on to your economy is, the more powerful expanding is against you. And frankly, I think that's something that's a bit missing in the current iteration of Stormgate. If we go after that, let's say there's another point to this entire avenue of expression. It's not just about AoE, it's autocasts. So I'm in favor of fewer autocasts. The reason being that if you have fewer autocasts, the more that you actually have to, as the player, click the ability on the units you want to use it on. This taxes your APM, this taxes your attention, and it gives you more to do but less time to do it in because the game is not trying to hold your hand and do it for you. Now, while there are certainly downsides to do that, there are some upsides that I don't see discussed nearly often enough. If the less time you have to do anything in the game, in Stormgate, then the more that players have to choose their optimalities. Most players don't have the APM to do everything that they want to do, the actions per minute, so they have to choose what they value more. And that not only shows the idiosyncrasies of their play style, it also allows the player to express themselves by choosing their own optimalities and rewards player decision making. This also, however, has the ability of over less time, players get to press the buttons. So they have a higher density of gameplay experience. They have a higher density of doing the thing that reminds them that they're playing an RTS, one of their favorite genres. And for strong players, this is particularly important as this is the genre they've cared about and put time and effort into. So they want to reinforce that dopamine hit of just playing the game and knowing that they're competent at the game and getting rewarded not only for their legacy skill, but also have the promise of new skills to develop, new things that they have to pay attention to. So without further ado, that was probably the fastest intro I'll ever do in my life. Let's go on to some of the changes. So these are universal changes, by which I mean these changes are going to affect everything. And the first thing you see is here is a bit of ambiguity, only because I don't have access to a unit editor, and I have not used my existing resources to make a full copy of Stormgate, so I can go ahead and see what unit values I think might be strong or other people might think are strong. Hint, hint to anyone else who's paying attention to that. So the first thing we want to talk about here is plus 20 to 25% movement speed. I'm not going to out exactly how far back inside of Stormgate's history I know that this happened, because that would be giving away who knows who was available at what time to give what information, etc. But I have a pretty good guess, a pretty strong reason to speculate that movement speed used to be much worse, and we can tell this even from the public-facing trailers inside of Stormgate, and yet for some reason it has gotten faster over time. My question is if that added small amount of speed has not in fact made the game better, then perhaps additional movement speed would do this as well. One of the biggest reasons to give things movement speed is that the faster the game moves, moves, the faster the game runs, the more possible it is for all players to miss micro, the more possible it is for them to have less time to accomplish any one goal that they wish to accomplish. Their micro can be a little less perfect than somebody else's. Their ability to multitask can be a little less refined than another person's, as you take seconds and transform them into quarter of a seconds that matter a bit more. This is certainly the approach that a game like StarCraft 2 took. This is not the only way that you could go forward. After all, there is the Warcraft 3 approach, which shows what you can do with higher TTK. However, as this is a balance patch, my main focus is on trying as best as possible to find changes that don't reinvent the functionality of something that already exists. And I consider a balance patch to be numbers, and design is pretty much everything outside of just the numbers. There are a few exceptions that you'll see in here, but basically, while I do think there's a lot of value in something like the Supreme Commander approach or the Warcraft 3 approach, that would basically be redesigning the game from the ground up to be something that it's not. If you wanted to make movement speed not as important and add more crowd control effects, who knows how much more you would be adding in terms of designing new abilities, new crowd controls, new armor types, and new interactions. That seems way too hard. So we're going to get to this, attack speed. One of the biggest reasons to add attack speed is that it keeps a lot of the fundamental unit relationships that people are accustomed to, but it makes them happen a little bit faster. This does mean that things that are already fast attack a little more because of the way the armor system works, right? It's not quite a StarCraft style armor system where the flat armor reduces. But, it'll make the game feel like it's happening faster. People will move to where they want to be faster, and they'll be attacking, and this will overall reduce the time to kill of the game, although by a comparably negligible amount. The next part we want to talk about here is universal. I know it only affects one group here, but we're going to talk about it universally because I think that it's an important standard to hold in place for AoE. The tech requirement for all siege units changed to Tier 2 only. So, for instance, the biggest one that's affected by this is the Atlas. The Atlas would only need Tier 2 in the mech bay, not a machine lab as well. The biggest reason for this is that I feel that any Tier 2 splash or siege or AoE unit is incredibly important for punching down on Tier 1 unit interactions and forcing the game to go to the next stage. For anyone who's been watching a lot of Celestial versus, or rather, we'll flip it, anyone who's been watching a lot of Vanguard versus Celestial as of late, how satisfying is it for both players that the Vanguard player has to make a shit ton of hedgehogs, which themselves don't have AoE, just to be incredibly cost efficient against Argents up until such point as the Celestial player either just keeps making Argents and tries to micro their opponent to death, or has to transition. I mean, I saw even yesterday 2,200 plus games in that matchup where it was just Argent versus Hedgehog, and I saw one where the Vanguard player won, and I saw one where the Celestial player won as well. And it wasn't very satisfying because there wasn't a whole lot of AoE, and I feel like this kind of impetus, this idea of AoE, will help fix a lot of these Tier 1 versus 1.5 versus 2 matchups from happening and allow the real punch down that lets the game get to the heart of an RTS multitasking experience. Not least because, though I can make this a whole video by itself, not least because the engine of Stormgate borrows a lot of cues from StarCraft 2 in terms of how many units you can grab, multiple building selection, the F2, in this case space, all army hotkey, right, and how many things you can have inside of a control group. All of these are more modern sensibilities since about 2010 when StarCraft 2 kind of changed the dynamic for everybody. And so if you're going to do that, you have to punish this kind of balling or death balling that can naturally happen when you take on those kinds of design considerations and think of them as always purely moving forward. Next thing I want to do is increase the siege splash damage by 15%. This would be for the 3 units that it affects, so it would be the Atlas, the Saber, and of course the Hellborn. We didn't touch the Hellborn in this match or talk about the fact that it hits air. I think that's pretty stupid, but we're going to leave it as is. And the biggest reason is that while there are splash units in the game, there seems to be a concentrated effort over time from Frost Giant Studios and from the balance or design of it or whoever works on that to make sure that AoE doesn't happen that way, that it doesn't feel bad that a whole bunch of Baneling equivalents come blow up your mineral line and make you feel like you were out of the game because you didn't pay attention for very long. But the side effect of that, the knock-on effect of that, is that you get into the thing that Artosis said said happens. And I asked him in the question, just full disclosure, in his stream, I didn't prime him with what I had said previously. What is the importance of AoE? How important is that in an RTS? He said it's incredibly important because it allows you to stop the game from being just a mass of tier 1 units, which frankly I think we're currently seeing inside of a lot of the matchups, the notable exception being IVI, or the Infernal mirror. And so I think added siege splash damage will stop people from deathballing, and maybe will encourage them from using the higher TTK, maybe the slower game pace, to split units off and multitask a bit more. Although there are a lot of systems that get in the way of that now, this patch would be an attempt to fix all of that. Alright, so the big one here, we talked about AoE, so we're going to get talking right now about autocast abilities. I'm not a big fan of autocast abilities. Again, you saw what I was talking about in the beginning for the presumption that, my basic assumption here is that if you have autocast abilities, it makes it incredibly difficult for you to display your skill relative to the skill that somebody else could be displaying. But what does that mean in practice? What does that mean in game? So we're going to go over the autocast abilities that I want removed, and you will notice that there's a series of buffs that come to almost all of these units as a consequence of this. Almost, not all, but to quite a few of them. So the Weaver Lash, enough problems said about the Weaver Lash, right? They had to nerf its efficacy in what units it was targeting, but it's just not satisfying to see someone who's very capable of their Weaver micro suddenly get that lost because now everyone has access to that Weaver micro. Brute Fiend Spawn, again, I want to stress here, I think that there's a better solution than returning the manual split to the Brute. However, that would require more design than I think either the Snowplay engine currently has or that the Frost Giant team is able to put in short notice. I want to give a shout out here to Ray. He suggested that you keep the Autocast Fiend split. The problem being then that you make it that the health of the Fiends that come out of the Brute changes based on the health of the Brute itself. I think there's some merit to that. That's interesting, but that's more on design and therefore not something I'm considering as harshly. In this case, we're talking more about you would have to get the Fiends manually. Medtech Nano Swarm for Vanguard. So it's just a noob trap that it auto casts, but it's kind of perverse in that way. It is a noob trap in that you don't want to spend the mana just on anything that happens to be in range, but sometimes it just happens to hit the sickest multicast you could ever ask for, and then everything is healing or getting damaged in a way that feels very frustrating, and you don't know that you aren't fighting your opponent, you're fighting the game that the opponent is being given courtesy of the way that the game is balanced right now. Notice that I didn't say that you should take away the Medtech's basic heal. It's actually important there that there is a skill difference. Heal doesn't actually do too much for the Medtech. It's very useful, but every time that you use it, you're actually losing some mana and making it harder for you to cast System Shock or Nano Swarm. And so the player decision to have passively their heal ability for the Medtech on or off is incredibly important. So we're not going to be getting rid of that as it is skill expressive in its own way. Animancer healing for the Celestial is much the same way. And then the Cabal Gravitic Flux, right? The flying units to ground. This thing is probably the poster child for something that is just way too powerful. And I think that you should be forced to manually have some interaction, even if that ability doesn't itself get nerfed. So we're going to go on to the next one here. So we're going to talk about actual changes. Like, okay, that's great. This is all fine in theory. What are the actual number values we're talking about? So let's get to them. So for Celestial, I want you to take all of these changes over here in group. And if this looks familiar to anyone who's in any other Discords or the like, I will fully give credit to this set of changes to Arail Stormgate. Arail, for anyone who doesn't know, hosts tournaments like well over 2K Celestial player, so he's not an Infernal player who just hates that matchup or a Vanguard player who just hates that matchup. His idea was as follows, and this is why I agree with him. So you reduce the build time of all buildings by 5 seconds. As for anyone who doesn't know, the Morph Core in constructing a building lowers the build time of that unit by 5 seconds as a replacement for the cost of the Morph Core itself, right? That is the benefit you get from using the Morph Core, using up its ability to do damage, to scout, to be any other building, to its replacement for just not using it and just making a thing, right? Is that normally the Morph Core reduces the build time of whatever it's doing by 5 seconds. So we're going to give that automatically to all of the buildings, right? Now, you might say then, wait, what's happening here? So the Morph Core, I would want its health reduced to 180. I believe it's currently at 260. And the problem with the Morph Core having 260 health is that in versus Infernal, you just grab 7 of them and then go ping your opponent to death with this thing that does 2 damage plus 6 versus light. And frankly, if this were a design balance change, like that's an oxymoron, but if this were a design change, I think Celestial needs to go back into the rework pile, because I think it's a fundamentally going to be a problem for all map design in the future, all balance discussions in the future, much like Warpgate was for Protoss all the way back in 2010 for StarCraft 2, to have this idea that, oh yeah, the Morph Core can fly, and the Prisms can fly, and the Arc Ship can fly, and actually, the array can also fly. I think fundamentally we're going to find out that that's a problem, but this is not a design change. This is as much as possible a balance change. So we're going to reduce the health, let them keep the damage. I'm going to assume that the damage values that they need are necessary to stop things like the Meat Farm Shroudstone rush, or stop every Vanguard player that one meta from just bunker rushing their opponent into submission when the Sovereign's Watch laser or the Sob Watch laser didn't actually kill buildings or workers, right? So we're going to assume that that damage value is fine for now, but the health that you have on the Morph Core is a little too high. It makes creeping too good, and it's a bit too good offensively. The thing that allows us to give the build time buff over here, hi, game friend. Feel free to add anything you want, by the way. The reason that I like this idea of reducing the build time by 5 seconds for all Celestial units is that I want the Morph Core to only be able to build the Arc Ship Collection Array, Power Bank, and Therium Purifier. And the reason for this is that Celestial has a whole host of problems that they bring to maps by virtue of the fact that Morph Cores specifically can fly, right? And that the Arc Ship flies. So Jagged Maw had many problems. They were more oriented towards the siege camp, but any map in which the air distance is noticeably, grotesquely closer than the ground distance, Celestial is going to bring natural problems. If you care about the lower end of the ladder, to the lower end of the ladder. If you care about the higher end of the ladder, well, we all remember Artosis' dead-looking face as we saw 3 Morph Cores versus 2 Morph Cores on Jagged Maw. Do you think it's an accident that that map was considered for shortly thereafter? I certainly don't think so. Oh, glad you're enjoying, game friend. So here's the reason that you do all of this, is that if you mix it so the Morph Core can only build the Arc Ship Collection Array, Power Bank, or Therium Purifier, no, not link nodes, because that leads to tower rushing every time, then actually the fact that the Morph Core can go ahead and construct only these buildings means that there is now a gate on proxies. The hope of doing this change is to make it such that Celestial versus Celestial is not so much a game in which one person gets an early Argent kill and then just keeps powering up their creation chambers on top of you until they bury you underneath their micro, and the benefit of having one extra unit. This is something that Arail himself said happened when he was playing against Mixu. Just as an example to show it happens in the real world, he said, I killed one of Mixu's Argents, and then I played the game for another 6 minutes until I was able to win, and there was nothing he could do, because 1, the macro is easy, and 2, 1 more Argent is just 1 more Argent forever, which means you win all the damage trades pretty much forever once you hit a certain skill floor represented by higher MMR. So the hope here is that Morph Core becomes less like a thing that is used less for proxying. It kind of makes it so the maps aren't as capable of being broken in half, right? These are some of the changes that the Morph Core can bring. It also means that any proxy you do is more all in. There is one big downside, however, which is that this is going to significantly delay by that period of seconds. Because Morph Cores can't transform into tier 2 buildings or structures, then you're going to have to wait for the entire build time of tier 2 in order for Morph Cores to transition into any other higher tech that you want. However, I'm not convinced that Celestials actually have that problem. There's kind of too much going on right now with the Argent to really figure out what's wrong. I think they have a number of solid units that they just don't have any impetus to get to because the Argent is really good, excepting, of course, I can hear you crying it now, Celestial v Infernal. So, Kree. Change the damage to 14. Change the damage from 14 plus 4 versus light to 14 plus 10 versus light. I believe it's plus 4 or plus 6 right now. Now, the reason you do this is pretty simple. The Kree actually are AoE. They are tier 1.5 AoE units. They once upon a time did way too much damage versus light units, and all the Vanguard players complained, and rightly so. The thing had 20 armor as it was rolling in on you. It was extremely fast. It goes up and just explodes in a bath of AoE, right? This is a big problem. But I do think that the Kree suffers right now as a problem. And the big reason that, hello Saki McSock Puppet, and the big reason that the Kree has a problem is that the Kree is supposed to be this anti-light unit, but in its mirror, it's a bit interesting. It's an anti-light unit, but it's fighting up against the Argent, which is not only ranged, but is heavy. Well, maybe it's more useful in other matchups. Is it really good at harassing? No, not really. Is it really good against Infernal Gaunts? No, not really. Is it really good against Exos? No, not really. Is it actually even good against Scouts? And the answer is no, not really. Because for a brief time, when we were playing Vanguard versus Celestial, I do see you, Saki McSock Puppet. For a brief time when there was Vanguard versus Celestial and you saw Nina play, there was a lot of Beryllium Claw Scouts plus Exos against Kree, and this was with a more powerful Kree. And why was that the balance that people were using? Because actually Kree's roll spin out is so bad that it's actually better for you to it was better for you to match the speed with a Scout and try and catch the unit as it's rolling onto you than for you to have a better armor type vis-a-vis having a Lancer. And so I think right now the Kree is in a really unfortunate spot where it's not doing enough damage against the units it's supposed to counter because it is anti-light. Most of the ranged units in the game are light. However, it's an anti-light unit that has missed all of its armor and doesn't even do enough burst damage to compensate. So the Kree is in a really, really sad spot right now. So I think some bonus damage versus light will return it to that spot. Also, it's AoE. Now, the next thing is that Kree Blaze of Light. For those of you who don't know, Kree's Blaze of Light is the explosion that they do. It does damage around themselves in an area on their death. Currently is at 20. This goal change, the goal of this patch change is to increase it to 40, and that is to make it so that it's more punishing if you don't actually get out of the Blaze of Light explosion area. I want to note that this is 40 damage before the upgrade, before an upgrade that gives plus 20. Hi, Go Sukon. And the reason that you want the 40 base plus 20 is that this means now that the Kree will one-shot any fiends that are on top of it, and I believe almost two-shot any mobs that are inside of it. Imps as well get kind of wrecked. Really good against Gaunts. Now, again, this is more at a lower level. At a higher level, this also means that the Kree is a bit better at actually harassing worker lines, because if the damage it's doing is not 20 damage, but potentially up to 60 damage, then that means that there is more to micro, more to care about, and yes, you have plenty of warning as to whether or not this will blow up and destroy your worker line. The Kree has died. It's making a sparking animation. It explodes, and then it does damage. This is ample time for any intermediate skill players to be able to grab things out of the way without feeling like, my banelings, right? And so I actually feel like this is a really good change to give the Kree some utility. It also means that flanking with the Kree is a lot better. So let's think about this. Right now, they don't use very many Kree to flank an Infernal army as Celestial. But let's think about why that is. Well, even if they do flank, first off, they're going to die without getting much done because their damage versus light against the squishy Gaunts in the back are almost nothing. They're not made really to fight Magmadons, and they're not strong at fighting them either. And that's totally fine. That's just a unit matchup problem for them, but it's okay that that's the case. But also they do so little damage with their blaze that not only do they not do damage when they roll out, hit you in the back as an Infernal anyways, but then when they blow up, they're doing 20 damage? Who fucking cares? You're dropping effigies and you're naturally getting some of your veil, some of your shroud skin, whatever you want to call it, back. So they're not even doing 20 damage to your health. They're doing like 16 damage to your health, and you don't care that they flank you. Now, if we have increased damage from Blaze of Light and increased damage versus light units, surrounding specifically Infernals is better when you get on top of Gaunts or harass their imps. And then also that means that if they like come up behind and cudgel your army, then you can't just back walk through them, can you? Because you're walking into a series of 40, possibly 60 damage mines. This is also going to make the Kree feel a little bit better against the Exo, which, I mean, frankly, it already didn't feel too bad against the Exo, but it's really hurting after its minus 20 nerf. Yeah, we're going to be going in this kind of depth at this kind of speed for a little bit of a while. I hope everyone finds this interesting. If anyone thinks I've lost my mind, by the way, you can feel free to just go ahead and say something in the chat. I'll be sure to just say hello and then read your comment, and maybe I'll laugh. Maybe I'll say, oh yeah, good point. Next unit I want to talk about is the Animancer. Animancer is a super cool unit with really good AoE that has the tiny insignificant problem of being designed to be bad at high level. So let me explain. So the Dark Prophecy slow of the Animancer's Dark Prophecy right now, in addition to being extremely expensive to get up to that tech, has a couple of behavioral traits that are disgusting if you want to get utility out of them. So the first is that the slow is 25%, and that's a good start. So it looks weird that we're nerfing it to 15% here. So it's going from 25, I'll just do that so you can see, right? So we're going from 25 to 15%. But why is that? Well, you have to understand that the Dark Prophecy damage originally is actually 20 DPS for 4 seconds, and then it's 40 DPS for another 4 seconds. So I want you to note what this actually means. This means that when you cast Dark Prophecy and you're using an Animancer, you're getting maximum value, your reward is that you have a 25% slow on a unit that anyone over about 2000 MMR is never going to get hit by unless it is the literal end of the game. And the reason for that is this. Look at those numbers, dude. 20 DPS for the first 4 seconds, and it only ramps up to its full 40 DPS for the last 4 seconds. So if you're stupid enough or incapable enough, or the game is so cursed enough that you're actually stuck inside of Dark Prophecy for 5 seconds, only then does the Animancer get the reward of this channeled spell from actually getting its utility. So really, it's a very expensive slow debuff. I decided that that's not good enough of a reason to use the Animancer, especially since the Kree has kind of lost some of its sturdiness in favor of damage. So we're going to go ahead and say, why are we waiting 5 seconds to get to 40 DPS? We're just going to start it. Hi, Frank. How's it going? We're just going to go and make the Animancer's Dark Prophecy. Yes, it goes from a 25% slow to 15%, but it goes and starts immediately at 40 DPS for 6 seconds. For anyone who can't do the quick math, this is actually 80. The first 20 DPS for 4 seconds is 80 DPS total, or 80 damage total, and then this is another 160. So you're doing 80 plus 160 over 2 sets of 4 seconds, and now you're doing the same 240 combined DPS. You're just doing it over 6 seconds immediately instead. Right? So you get the more immediate impact off of your Animancer's Dark Prophecy right the hell now. One of the biggest problems that affects Animancers is that they have this really big problem called the Weaver Lash, right? They also have another big problem, which is that their range is just a little too low. And the reason that that's a problem is this. You can't really ward off things at the edge of your vision or at the edge of the battlefield or of the fight to come. You can't prepare Dark Prophecy very well because the range is middling. And so actually you get this weird scenario where you have to kind of be in a choke and then ward off with the Dark Prophecy at mid-range, but then you don't have the spell when you actually want to take the actual fight. Now, I don't want to give extra casts of Dark Prophecy. We might lead to a miasma problem if we do that, for anyone who remembers Tier 2 Hex and Masterwork training. But I do think that right now it leads to this awkward scenario where the best Dark Prophecies are cast at range 1 or 2 away from the front of your army. And that means that your opponent, when they commit, you put a giant get the hell off of me shield. And frankly, I don't think the +1 range will change that is a good use case for Dark Prophecy, but it might also extend a Dark Prophecy case to using it to ward off or maybe even to harass. Yes, that's a bit ambitious to think of, but I think that that's not a bad thing to have your opponent have to weave through a celestial equivalent of a miasma of AoE in order to get to you, especially because this is a unit that is channeling the entire time, thus can be interrupted by anything. You can be interrupted by a Sentinel, you can be interrupted by a Weaver Lash. If a Magmadon runs up and says, I don't give a shit about your Dark Prophecy, like Frank Sriracha emote style, right? Then you lose it for all those reasons. Therefore, it should probably be a bit more powerful and give you some agency at range, as opposed to, well, I guess I'll cast this spell. Shame it's going to get canceled, but I guess I cast this spell. Right, that's what we're working on. And then the final thing is the Animancer Dark Prophecy upgrade cost. It was 100 Luminite, 100 Therium, and I believe 60 seconds. The suggested change here is to lower its Luminite costs and lower the time that it takes to do it. Animancers with and without Dark Prophecy are completely different units, so much so that you're basically getting Animancers because you know they want to have Dark Prophecy. This helps you get them online 20 seconds faster, which I don't see as a downside, considering, again, down. We want to kick away balls of tier 1 units. And as for why the Luminite reduction, the Celestial faction is already pretty starved in terms of Therium when they're getting to the point where they care about Animancers. And so Animancers themselves being expensive, it doesn't make sense to stack high Luminite cost on top of them. And I thought about making it 25 Luminite, 100 Therium. That just doesn't feel good. There's not too many things that have those costs in the game. All right, cool. Everyone tracking? No one called me an idiot yet? Don't worry, that's what YouTube and whatnot are for. That's all good. Scythes, movement speed to 6. For anyone who's not played as Celestial, I heard some Celestial players say this. I was like, nah, it's not true. So I went and I watched about 25 games. Again, not a huge sample size, but like looking specifically for this. I just looked for Celestial v Infernal games that got to the point where the dragon was made. Right? And you know what I saw that was kind of crazy? Scythes fucking suck against the dragon. Like, not only, okay, for anyone who doesn't know, Scythes have an ability that when they're within range 4, they do an extra 100% of their damage. The problem is that their current movement speed is so low that actually other flying units can either, if not kite them, just run away. And this means that the Scythes get 1, maybe 2 amazing volleys on enemy air unit. Oh shit, then they fly away. Oh, that's upsetting. Okay, sick. So increasing the Scythe movement speed to 6, alongside some of the other airspeed changes that you're going to see here, makes it more likely that they can go ahead and attack the dragon. I also want to keep it in mind that while the Flayed Dragon is still faster, it's either 6.25 or 6.5 movement speed, the average movement speed of things in the game has been increased by about 20%. And what this means is that there's more miss micro opportunity where the Scythes are likely to get on a Flayed Dragon that's not perfectly controlled, and that can be more punishing for the player who's gotten that happen to them. The dragon is the sexiest unit. I mean, if you're into flayed things, are you into flayed things, Mr. McSock Puppet? I just need to know if you're an Infernal player. All right, so the next one is, don't worry, we're going to get to the Infernal changes and whatnot, pretty soon, right? We're going to get to that pretty soon. Yep, I like Infernal. Fair enough. Yeah, we're going to get there. So Archangel. Meteor Strike upgrade training time down from 120 seconds to 60 seconds. And the Archangel dive bomb damage up from 100 to 175. Let me go ahead and put that over here so you can see it and not have to memorize it like some deranged human being has done. Now, here's the reason for that. For anyone who's been like, well, Arail helped make these patch notes, and Arail loves Archangel, so it must be overpowered. It's like, no, I've seen games where it gets shut down pretty well. For anyone who doesn't know what these are, Meteor Strike is an upgrade that does 20 damage per second over the course of 10 seconds on the point of Archangel's dive bomb, and the dive bomb itself is what causes the Archangels, when they're up in the air, to come crashing down and do damage. Now, there was a suggestion from other people in the chat, why don't you make it easier for all the buttons to be pressed for the Archangel? Then you're not paying attention to the kind of patch notes I'm making. Like, I don't care if you think that it's a simple unit that has too many buttons. I love that it has too many buttons. I think that's great. The Archangel has a couple of problems in terms of its movement speed and the fact that it is a melee flying unit, which is on its surface probably one of the worst things that you could ever aspire to be in Stormgate or in pretty much any RTS. And they're maybe not tanky enough, but rather than go for extra hit points or extra damage or have to worry about avatar or things of this nature, like whatever their like cleave smack damage is, no. We just decided the cool thing about this unit, the cool AoE, is that they come down from the sky and smack you like they're doing their best Final Fantasy VII impersonation. And so reducing the time that takes by 60 seconds is drastic, but also means that once they're on the field, you force the game to get to a different stage of the game once Archangels are on the field, especially when it's 60 seconds down from 120 seconds, because even if that turns the game into Archangel spam, you're going to find out that actually those tier 3 units have a lot of counterplay to them, a lot more than people are suspecting right now that they're hit with the blue moon of the new idea that they could be even units in the game. As for why the damage would be changed over here from 100 to, why the damage here would be changed from 100 to 175, this hits a couple new interesting breakpoints, right? The big thing about the dive bomb damage is that right now it's really best used to go hit imps, go hit mobs, things like this. It's not really used to just shit on an army unless your opponent's not split whatsoever or they are just standing there with gaunts trying to attack up, in which case you're not getting extra value out of this. The real real point here is to make the Archangel more capable of hitting buildings, like, defensive structures like Shroud Stones, and when they're full health, why not let them do it? Also, if someone wants to carpet bomb, do the manual version of the helicarrier bombing run, but just with Archangels, wouldn't that be sick? Wouldn't it be cool to see someone do that? And think about, again, the benefits that I've been talking about as we're going through this of all the AoE. The more AoE that there is in the game, the more you're rewarding people for splitting their army, having appropriate counter units, moving elsewhere on the map, minor harassment, right? These kinds of things stack up and become more useful. And also, while I've been critical of Stormgate's and Frost Giant Studios' inclusion in Stormgate of air collision, there's the auto magic box, units can't get congealed together. I think in this case, this is helping make it so the Archangel can be a bit more buffed. And it kind of represents this flying fleet of doom. Who doesn't want that? It sounds pretty sick, right? All right. We're going to go on to the next one. Here we go. Infernal. Now, the big takeaway, Saki McSock Puppet, sick name, by the way. The big takeaway that you have to have from this, and hi, Psionic, the big takeaways you have to have from this are as follows. Again, I'm not trying to redesign the Brood. I think that someone like Ray came up with a cool idea as to how the Fiends only pop out of the Brood at a certain health increment relative to what health the Brute had whenever it died, right? I'm not talking about that. We're assuming that we can take the very simple balance change of reverting the Brute Autocast change. And what I mean by that is this. I really liked it, frankly. I don't care if it was a bit overpowered. Anything like this is naturally gonna be. I don't really think it was uninteresting to have the Brute get no Fiends if it didn't split, and then do get Fiends if you manage to split it. You might say that, it's just attacks, it's an APM hack, it just punishes people because they don't have enough APM. Well, you could say whatever you want to about it. One of the big downsides of making it so that everyone got Fiends every time a Brute was killed automatically with no micro requirement is that actually you had a bunch of balance problems after you did that, didn't you? A lot of the balance problems sounded suspiciously like, we've got to nerf the Fiend and nerf the Brute. So you took these units that didn't even feel good. The Brute finally feels good with the slop range changes that were put in, but you had to take these units that some people felt were lumbering and slow, but actually very powerful and felt quite nice, right, in terms of their potency, in terms of their strength, especially Infernal players thought this, and now they just have like a borked, sad version of the Fiend and of the Brute as a consequence. Since we're taking away the autocast where you automatically get your Fiends once the Brute dies, right, which thus has more skill disparity between the people who can do this and can't do this, right, it makes therefore more sense to go ahead and buff the Fiends and the Brutes. Now, and what's great about this kind of ability is that it actually increases you get rewarded linearly for each instance that you're able to do this, right? So if anyone thinks that's way too much clicking, you actually get more rewarded. So let's look at the Fiend. Damage is going to go up by 14.28% from 7 to 8. And then the Fiend is going to go from 40 health. We're just going to show this. It's going to go from 40 health to 48, and for anyone who doesn't know, Veil is 25, or the white health, right? Veil or the white health is always 25% of the unit's health. I suspect that is hard-coded in the engine, which is why when you see, anytime there's a hit point change, magically there's also a change to the unit's white health, or its Veil, or its Shroud Skin, whatever you want to call it. I think that that's hard-coded in the engine as a number, as opposed to having to be manually changed each and every instance, but that's neither here nor there. So the idea here is that the Fiend gets a damage buff and it gets hit point buffs. I want to note specifically that even if it does have its full new 48 health and 12 Veil, that it nevertheless doesn't live through a plus Blaze of Light upgraded Kree explosion, which I think is pretty important. Also, you're only getting this unit when you're not using effigies, you're not using Skull of Shedda, right? You're not using Gaunt abilities. You're only getting this unit, actually, whenever you manually split the Brutes. And so you might have a more powerful army after this. I think that could be incredibly interesting to Infernal players, and please gives us a little more excitement in what we're actually seeing in the game. All right. Brute. Brute was previously, we're going to go ahead and put this here, the Brute was previously 160 hit points and it had 5 armor. Now, because of the way that armor works inside of because of the way that armor works inside of this game, right? 5 armor was basically adding an extra 8 health. So you had a brute that had 160 health, and it went up to 168 health. And the suggestion here is to turn it into an effective 196 health, right? Because you have 180 health plus 10% of that in armor is 198, I'm sorry. And so basically you're getting a flat 30 plus hit point buff to the Brood because again, you're not getting a Fiend for free every time you get it on the other side. And so it makes sense that this thing is more of a lumbering Colossus. I'm not opposed to things like some damage increases for the Brute. The problem is that the Brute has a couple of very interesting key points where if it hits a little bit harder, you all of a sudden change the numbers needed to destroy defensive fortifications or workers. So I really didn't want to touch that. Making it more survivable gives you an extra opportunity to really recognize when it's about to die as well, so it won't pop quite as quickly. Inflamed Imp. Right, so Inflamed Imp, there's one set of AoE that exists in the game, and this is going to be a nerf because this is from 1 second to 2 second. There's another change in here that I want to go ahead and let's scroll down. Control C. Control V. And we're just going to show you this. There we go. So there is one set of changes here, and this is kind of meant to be taken together. Here's the problem I have with the Inflamed Imp. I love watching Inflamed Imps when someone takes like 4 imps away from their army, and they go put them towards the front of a Celestial army, and they say, if you ever step across this line, Looney Tunes style, I'm going to flame on all of these like they're Johnny Storm, right? And they're over in the Fantastic Four, and I'm just going to blow your shit up. And they're going to do so much damage. They're going to have that like pseudo jump lock on. It's fantastic, right? It's great to see Inflamed Imps. The biggest problem is that Inflamed Imps as they currently exist, yes, they're Therium expensive. They're 25 Therium for each one that you do this for, but they really act as a no, can you please fuck off with your drops unit? And that's kind of a problem, right? Because you want to see drops of ground units, not necessarily all of these things tied purely to air units. And while there's a number of other things that Infernal has that makes that less possible, the Super Shroud Stone is definitely one of them. I'm in favor of removing it, but again, you'd have to design what its replacement is, and I don't really think that numbers can fix the problem that unit building top bar ability represents, so I didn't talk about it here. I do think it's a problem that you can just say, well, if I have, let's Control Z that, well, if I do have extra Therium, we just flame on. And so I actually want there to be more harassment and more counterplay for the person who's doing the drop, so they can kind of have a chance to see the Therium expenditure and then punish the Therium expenditure without losing their units, right? It's like, oh, you weren't in position, you had to make Inflamed Imps, I can get out of there. And that's why the nerf for Flame On is from 1 to 2 seconds. The idea here being that the Inflamed Imp duration would go from 5 seconds to 7 seconds, because if you nerf the case of it being used as base defense, you are automatically nerfing the case where it gets used offensively against an army. And actually the extra 2 seconds matters a lot. It might only have to even be a 1 second increase, because the most common counterplay right now for Inflamed Imps, if you see them walking towards you with their ridiculous 100 AoE damage, that's like kind of insane, right? The most common counterplay against that right now is to run your army away, and having to run your army away or pre-split or give up another full 2 seconds of ground might actually make Inflamed Imps really good in the army case, while also nerfing them in the just automatically stop things in my base sense. All right. Saki McSock Puppet, I know that you said that you love Infernal. Are we ruining your day? Does this make everything sound sad and miserable to you so far? Just let me know if it is, okay. Hex and Miasma. So we're going to revert the Miasma Radius nerf. There's a lot of things you could do for the Hexen. But speaking purely from Vanguard v Infernal, who was upset at seeing high-level master training work Hexen? Who was upset about that? Yes, once we learned that you couldn't just use Lancer Medtech Exo and solve your problems that way as Vanguard, who was disliking? Yes. Yeah. Well, here's the thing, right? Everyone loves buffs to their own faction. But yes, I do think that they feel a bit anemic. Also, I'm not taking away the Lancer's bonus delight that's over there, or the Beryllium Claws for Vanguard. Yeah, Yeah, maybe I will now. Here's the hope, right? And here's the thing with Hexen Miasma. So the Tier 2 Master Training Hexen at intermediate level was oppressive and everyone felt bad about it. At high level, if you watched like the 22, at the time 2400 I think was the peak MMR that people were hitting, 23, 2400, who was upset at watching Vanguard Sentinels have to silo out channeling Hexens and then take the fight separately against Magmadons and then kite everything and then, have counterplay? Who was upset by that, right? And so I think that the Hexen actually kind of died for the sins of people, frankly, who are my skill level or lower, right? Like, just, you can do a bunch of things. You can change how, whether or not, you can change the duration of its channel. You can change how long the spell lasts. You can change the infest stacking damage that it deals. But I think the most interesting one here is the radius, because notice what we did with the Animancer, right? Where we gave it +1 range and didn't change the AoE size of Dark Prophecy, but increased its damage. If you increase the range or the miasma radius nerf, right, you revert that for the Hexen, it can hit more area, it can lock down more space now than it could previously, or it will be able to do more in the future than it can currently, right? And I think that's actually an interesting way to kind of give the Hexen some of its mojo back. I wouldn't be opposed to reverting all of the Hexen miasma changes, but we just, yeah, I feel like miasma is more like area denial than area damage. Easy to dodge just one. Yeah, and that's why increasing the size, Saki McSock puppet, I think, would make it more permissible, right? You have bigger area, you have a larger area that you're covering with the miasma. I think that's more interesting, frankly. The Weaver. Oh boy. I can't wait to get shit about this. Ready your fucking body for Weaver buffs and nerfs. Okay, Weaver. Here's the reason that these changes happen the way that they do inside of the Weaver, okay? So I don't like Shroud Weave. I think Shroud Weave is pretty bad. I think Return to Hanger is bad. I think all of these abilities whose primary purpose is to get you out of jail for something that you kind of screwed up on is uninteresting. And I think designing units with this failsafe is never going to feel good. What is your opponent supposed to do if they see you Shroud Weaving away? Just not let the Weaver Shroud Weave away? Like, this is very boring in terms of gameplay. It also doesn't leave a whole lot of counterplay really for either side, right? I get that the Weaver is a slow and expensive unit, right? I've got it. I got that that's the concept. It's supposed to look lumbering and boring. Yeah, it's supposed to look lumbering and it's supposed to be slow and it's supposed to have this sick ability. Oh, and it does damage per hit, right? I get it, but it's just boring, dude. It's just not fun. So here's a couple of changes, right? So the Weaver, first off, Lash is one of the coolest abilities in the game. I want to remind you that we removed the Lash cooldown, like the Lash Autocast. No Lash Autocast in the game. Period. Done. Removed. So you have to give something to compensate for that, right? You can't just take someone's toys away without giving them a piece of candy, as it were. And so for the Weaver, the Lash cooldown is going to go down from 15 seconds to 12. One of the cool things about doing this is that Weavers on average are living about that long before they die if they're focused. This means that they can lash 2 things instead of 1 if they're in a well-positioned army. It also means that they can run away and kind of do their own slow version of Stutter Step Micro by having access to more than 1 lash. I think it's pretty satisfying. There are some issues that I have with lash, especially the fact that you can target something that's in range and then the unit can leave range and the lash still goes and grabs them, right? But we're not touching any of that. I think let people have their cool shit, right? Now, Weaver, remove Shroud Weave. Why does the Weaver have Shroud Weave? Because it's slow and physically large. Okay, so we're just gonna fix that, right? Change its base movement speed to 3.25. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, the Weaver has a passive on it that gives it plus 60% movement speed when it is on. We're not supposed to call it a creep, but we all know it's like Shroud, right? When it's on its Shroud, it's giving plus 60% movement speed. Can you manually kill your own spell hogs or fell hogs to accelerate Animus? I think it's like 0.5. I'd have to check. That's a marksman question. He would 100% know the answer to that. He is the king of these things. Hello, ha 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 ha. With that, so if you're going to remove Shroud Weave, right, then you have to give something to the Weaver because it's currently current movement speed of this thing is 2.5, and with Shroud Weave giving 60%, right? It goes from 2.5 off of this, off of its shroud to movement speed 4. But we're going to increase it, I would suggest, to 3.25. And the reason being, you can't just make units have a get out of jail free card because you want them to be slow. Come on, man, that's not interesting. That's not cool. So just increase the movement speed of the Weaver to base 3.25, and hello, haha 12. The idea here is that plus 60% on this is going to give something like 1.5 plus. It's 18 plus 1.5 is 1.95, is going to make its movement speed, 5.2. Something like that when it is on there. So it's going to become a very fast unit and very good at base defense, very good at mobilizing and moving around when it is on effigies, when it's on its shroud, but pretty bad off of it, right? 3.25 is not that fast. And you might say that that's a little more frustrating, that you can't kill it because it just runs away. There might be a number value that's lower than this that's appropriate, right? Maybe 2.85 is a better option because 2.85, 60% of that is going to give it 88, 4168 is 4.5, right? Or 4.3 movement speed. And maybe you think that's okay because Exos move at movement speed 4, right? That doesn't feel as bad. So we're just going to put in a thing here like maybe it's 2.85, but that's the idea, right? And then Flayed Dragon, I'm sorry, Infernal players. We're going to give some other buffs, as you've noticed here, but the big problem with the Flayed Dragon right now is that even after the increases over there on the cost, right, I know what your mirror looks like. Your mirror looks dope up until the point that you're both ignoring the rest of the game to have a Flayed Dragon. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure, Psionic. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I have minimal skills used for minimal gain. So here's the thing with the Flayed Dragon, right? IVI is incredibly interesting up until the point when both players realize the thing that I'm going to now tell you that they don't want you to realize. IVI gets to a point in certain high MMR games where no one wants to attack, because if you do, all you're doing is feeding Animus to each other and trading off your Therium banks. And because of the charge mechanic, you're just getting more charges back. That's incredibly boring, dude. And it's all happening because you know there's a Flayed Dragon at the end of it that's punishing you, because if you're the person who has to reset for charges, you're down that Animus so you don't have the Flayed Dragon first. That's so boring, dude. No one is having fun with that particular interaction. Also, listen, Infernal players, we got to give the Celestial players a bone. Even though they have sides set speed, movement speed 6 right now, it's kind of whack that multiple, these 25 games I referenced earlier that get to the end game just become like 82%. I calculated it's some like over 80% win rate for the Infernal player in high MMR from replays I watched. Not like just in the recent ordering of the past, if they get a Flayed Dragon. Who wants to see that? Like, I get that the Flayed Dragon is super cool. I don't want to nerf it in any way. In terms of its stats, in terms of its cost, right? If it wants to be a superhero unit, it can be that. It just has to be here at 200 Animus instead of 150. This is going to give you an extra third of the game if you're a Celestial player. Really an extra quarter of the game because of the way that economies ramp up and the way that Animus ramps up and that. And then for the mirror, it should extend the mirror, the most interesting mirror from what I can tell, into this Gaunt plus barely any brutes plus Doombringer plus Magmadon duel. That's super cool. Let's keep more of that. And then finally, the Magmadon. Listen, the Magmadon has the problem, right, that the Magmadon is so slow that anytime the Magmadon wants to do a thing, it has to make sure that it can actually fight. I saw some appalling games, Vanguard v Infernal. I know what you're complaining about, Infernal players. Why is it that the Vanguard player can kite, but I'm not allowed to kite, and I'm not really allowed to retreat because they can kite? And so the idea here is that the Magmadon Stomp should probably give bonus movement speed. There are other abilities in the game that give movement speed when they're activated. If you really want to, you could say that they have Oh, here's the thing, ha ha ha. The mirror might reach stalemate waiting for the dragon until later. The problem is that void, that extra 50 animus void, doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's 50 animus more of actionable gameplay. So whereas now you're both at like 90 to 110, and you're like, no, we're going to hold off actually. Now if you're at 90 to 110, 200's a very far distance away. There might be a lot more play left in the game, right? And so you might actually play the game more than just going to superhero unit, right? That's assuming they don't fix the flayed dragon. I think, again, design wise, I think you have to fix the way that the flayed dragon is purchased, because it is just basically a command and conquer Tiberium Sun, like mammoth siege tank type unit. I think that fundamentally has problems inside of Stormgate, but I also think that, again, the changes to things like movement speed are going to really help make those interactions different and make it more punishing, because again, everything has 10% more attack speed, everything has 20 to 25% bonus movement speed. It's more likely that you'll fuck up earlier in the game, and so that extra 50 animus of time is not 50 animus in terms of current Stormgate play. It's more like 55 to 60 animus in terms of current Stormgate play, because of the speed at which things will happen, right? But I do think it's kind of whack. Yeah, but I do think it's kind of whack that the Magmadon just has to sit there and really hope that, like, it is anything other than a get off me tool to stop the engagement of Lancers from Vanguard players. And also, like, the Magmadon is super cool, dude. Do we really not want super cool units? Again, think about the premise of this patch. We want more AoE. We want more things to be AoE, have impact in the game, right? This won't get the plus 15% siege damage bonus that the other, siege engines like the Saber and the Atlas and the Hellborn will get. But this is a really good thing that this thing shits in IVI on Gaunts, and that the Magmadon is really good against Exos. But you have to contend with the reality that Exos do have quick draw hustle, and frankly, if the Magmadon has a small movement speed buff, yes, I know Elf somewhere is crying about, not actually crying, but is like not a fan of the idea that Magmadon dominates this matchup and that you can't split them as easily. But one of the benefits of having Gaunts get wrecked by the Magmadon so hard is that you can drop them more. Multitasking. Okay, cool. Right. On to the next one. Any questions, comments, concerns, people yelling at me from the screen telling me I'm wrong? I can't wait. I cannot wait. Now you know what you were waiting for. All of you. It's Vanguard. That's right. That's right, baby. It's Vanguard. Okay, so Vanguard. Remove all the return to hanger abilities. I said I don't like Shroud Weave, right? And we're going to get back to the Doombringer. Actually, you know what? Let's just get the Doombringer back here. Here we go. 1 second. Okay, listen, this one has the least. I kind of forgot about this one, but, that just shows that I'm not an Infernal player. But let's just go back here so that you can see. There we go. Change Doombringer armor type, add armor, remove Shroud Weave. I don't have exact numbers for this. It's probably the only time that I've got this. I think that the Doombringer fulfills a very different role than what you see from something like the evac, right? The evac is supposed to be fast, drop things off, and then split back. That's kind of the thing that's envisioned inside of it. It has a speed upgrade, for God's sakes. But the Doombringer doesn't have a speed upgrade, and it's kind of lumbering. And actually, it's more powerful as an offensive tool because it generates Shroud around it. Yes, thank you, Saki McSock Puppet. I am curious as to what you think was wrong there. I am genuinely want to hear. I think that kind of conversation is way more interesting on here than I could get on something like Reddit, for instance. The actual Pit of Vols. So here's the thing about the Doombringer, right? It drops basically an effigy. It drops Shroud. It generates value for you. It's great to drop with Gaunts because it gives the Shroud. It's giving white health. It has its own white health. It has like these upgrades that are more combat focused, right? It is kind of this like rolling tank. It's not an APC underground like armor, personnel carrier and like Command and Conquer. This thing is like, boom, we are here. And so I actually think that the Doombringer armor type should should probably be removed so that it doesn't take any bonus damage from any sources. And in a game where we have a plus armor type system, not having an armor type is very, very good for a unit. It means you're not getting hit by any incidental bonus damage by anything, right? Not by light, not by heavy, not by creep, not by building, nothing. And then I also think that you should increase the armor of the unit itself. Probably the most unsatisfying thing is watching the Doombringer start to Shroud Weave and everyone stop trying to hit it because they know it's just going to get away anyways. How boring is that on this slow ass unit? If you want it to be slow, I want it to be slow. I respect the vision. Let's keep it slow and impactful. Give it some extra armor, right? I don't know the exact amount of armor. I would have to go combing through archives to figure it out. But I think that that fits the nature of the Doombringer and separates it nicely from evac in a very faction-specific way. All right, ladies and gents, we're back. We're back. And what are we back with? Vanguard. All right, so remove all return to hangar abilities. Again, I don't like Shroud Weave because it's a get out of jail free card. And you know what else I don't like? Return to hangar, because you just see this same interaction happen where there's someone defending, trying to handle the expert control of some strong Vanguard player, and then on top of having to fight a multitasking battle with RTS, they can just press a button that. Think about what Return to Hangar does. It's so cracked out of its mind, it's crazy. Return to Hangar takes your flying unit, gives it bonus movement speed, magically sends it back to the hangar that is nearest to you, and it repairs it for the low cost of what? You can't micro that unit again until it's back at full health, which no Vanguard player cares about because they're just setting down a sentry post and then changing it with a Bob inside to be a repair-o-matic. Right? And maybe they've got a habitat on top of that. So this thing is going to immediately get healed and then come back out. And think about all the skill expression that loses. You know what happens when I press return to hangar? Same thing that happens when Albino presses return to hangar, right? Assuming that neither one of our units die, they just go back to the hangar. We've got a building set up. It heals it. And then the difference between him and I is what? The control of the unit while it was out? Okay, this wouldn't change that at all. The fact that I might not remember to get my unit out as fast as he does. Sound amazing, sick. I love that. Whereas instead, if you get rid of return to hangar, you actually have to use the movement speed of the unit to get it the fuck out of dodge. You have to pay more attention to what's on the way. You don't auto-magically run faster than everything in the air that could possibly mess with you. And having that, since it doesn't go back to hangar, you have to send it back to the location of your sentry post, back to the location where it has the repair-o-matic. You might have to pull Bobs to actually repair it itself. Now let's think of this new scenario, the difference between Albino and myself. Albino and I both don't have return to hangar. You're going to get much more value out of Albino's Hornet than you are mine, because he's going to send it back at a healthier state. It's not going to die or be as likely to die as mine is, because I may need the bonus movement speed, but he's less likely to need it. He's more likely to send it back to a specific clicked part of the map than I am, right? And he's more likely to go repair the unit faster and then recollect it and move it out than I am. Look at all those difference in skill, different moments of skill expression, right? Okay, so just remember that, but this means that we're going to remove some, we're going to give some buffs to air. Again, we'll find out whether or not it's good. Okay, exo base damage, right? Exo base damage. Here's the big. Wait, no repair. Should the thing still repair at all? Yeah, exactly. Thank you, C. Clempe. I appreciate it. Yes. And I'm also gonna put this on YouTube so people could just tell me that I'm wrong. Whereas if you think you're wrong, people just tell you and then they forget about it later. This will be eternal history. All right. So exo base damage. I'm so tired of minus damage for the exo. Also, here's the big benefit of doing exo increased base damage. For anyone who doesn't know, it's going from 13 plus 5 to just flat 16 or 15. And here's the reason. First off, minus 1 exo damage is a meme, has always been a meme, wasn't actually the most powerful thing to do even when it didn't have that minus 1 damage nerf. Secondly, versus Infernal, Magmadons are now faster, right? Flame Imps are gonna last longer. So all that AoE is just way better. Oh, what do you mean go to sleep? It's only 7:30 my time. I'm perfectly awake. Yeah. Oh, guten Nacht. Yeah. Yeah. Schlaf sich. Like, get thyself to sleep, my friend. So here's the thing about the Exo too. The Exo is just inherently a more interesting unit to micro than the Lancer. It just is. Every time it hits something, it gets to move faster. Why wouldn't we want to emphasize the skill pattern of the Exo in favor of something like the Lancer? Here's the other reason. Vanguard V and Vanguard right now has this big problem called the Hedgehog. And before that, it had a really big problem. You know what that problem was called? The Scout. And here's the problem with Exos versus the Scout. Exo is a light unit that was dealing bonus damage to heavy. What type is the Scout? Light. Okay, not actually a heavy unit. And then the Exo has this Therium cost and this tech requirement that also makes it kind of incompatible with fighting the Hedgehog. So, like, what the fuck point is there in having the Exo? The Exo is, as many people have said, just a worse, in the mirror, just a worse, slower, non-repairable Hedgehog. How boring is that? That's awful. So you just make it a good base unit. And here's why you want to do that for Vanguard v Vanguard, right? I already kind of explained why I think that Infernal will be fine. I know the Therium cost, is pretty high, but you have better Fiends, you have better Brutes. Also, the Exo is not doing bonus damage versus Brutes to get 18 damage before. It's now only doing 16 damage, so it's actually doing more against Gaunts, less against Brutes, right? And a little bit more against Fiends, but the Fiend health buff actually compensates for that. And here's why you want this for Vanguard v Vanguard, right? Is that Vanguard v Vanguard, you want the Exo to be the best unit in the mirror. You want it to be. Because if it's Scout versus Scout, we all fucking saw how that was. That was like 4 to 6 weeks of, hey, do you know the build order and all the cancel tech? You do? Cool. We're going to have a micro battle. If you fuck up once, I have an insurmountable advantage over you. And I'm not listening to anyone who's like, actually, there was a Vulcan rush that you could do. No, there was not. There was not. Even at the highest level, Vanguard v Vanguard was, if you were playing and scouting, which also the Scout is a great scout unit because of its Z ability, you just micro piss fire against one another until somebody dies because their APM wasn't as good and their concave wasn't as good, or who knows, maybe you glitched around a Luminite ore. Now, here's the thing. You don't really want it to be Hedgehog v Hedgehog either, because while Hedgehog v Hedgehog can be interesting, it tends not to be, because Hedgehogs are repairable, the synergy with the medtech is very high, and also because they're so fast that they kind of punish any transitions really quickly. You actually want the Exo to be so good as well, because think about what the logical counter is. Unlike Scouts, didn't have a counter until we buffed the Lancer. Unlike the Hedgehogs, not really looking like we have a counter to them in the mirror. What's the natural counter? It's a thing we already buffed. It's the Atlas. Isn't that sick? Who doesn't want Atlas Exo? Think like Atlas Exo, what that naturally encourages, right? Sharp objects. Yeah. So Atlas Exo is far more interesting than Scout Wars, or frankly even Hedgehog into MedTech Vulcan Hedgehog Wars, right? It just is. Okay, so that's why I want the Exo to be stronger. And hopefully we gave enough tools and enough of a nerf, right? Because now think about this, the Exo is going to do -2. I know I'm talking about this a lot because there's going to be people who are like, who the fuck wants Exos to just do raw 16 damage? What a nightmare. Yeah, well, look at this now. Well, the problem is that the Vulcan is heavy. So now the Exo is not doing it's missing bonus damage against the Magmadon, Brutes, Argents, and it's missing them now against Vulcans. So now the Exo is just a more interesting unit to have as the base of your mirror. Lancer. We're going to get rid of this because I don't believe it anymore. Atlas, baby! All right, so we got Atlas buffs. We have fucking Atlas buffs, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, we got Atlas buffs. Look at this. So, the Atlas. Here's the thing about yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the Atlas is more iconic. I think the Atlas or the Vulcan are both good units to have, but I think that the Vulcan has severe problems against both Exos and against Lancers. Basically, the Vulcan just turbocharges Lancers to kill you, and Exos can outrange and have more damage because they can just ping fire. They can just kite away. Atlas, huge buffs for the Atlas. So you already saw that, I think, universally. This is already true for the other two factions. Your tier 2 siege unit should have no requirements other than the building that makes it, and having tier 2. So that's one buff that's explicitly for the Atlas. Next one is whatever the projectile speed is. I said it could be 20%, it could be 25%. Let's say it's 20%, so you get my idea. Projectile speed should be 25% increase for the Atlas. This means that the Atlas should be gaining more projectile speed than the average movement speed of units. Now, this is going to make it much harder for you to dodge all of the shots. Also, Atlas, I think its base movement speed could be increased up to 3.5. The problem is that they're pretty slow, like really slow, and the maps are a bit too large for it. I'm sold on this buff the least. I think that you could slow it down. What I would actually like to see is everyone get off the rump and just allow us to have Atlas drops again. I think Atlas Exo is fucking sick, and I don't understand why it was nerfed. It got nerfed kind of in the same way the Hellborn did. You know how like the Atlas has this like, oh, target acquisition, we're ready. Wait for the shot to land. Okay, our target acquisition, that's so boring, dude. Please, why do you think no one can hit things with this unit? It's because it just does this huge windup. I'd be fine with the Hellborn losing that as well. The Hellborn can catch a stray buff as well. Now, here's the thing about the Atlas. Plasma Arc Infusion is either 90 seconds or 60 seconds for anyone who doesn't know. That's the damage that's dealt on the ground when you are hit by this unit. I think that needs to be, the time on it needs to be buffed. Needs to be a time reduction because it's actually a soft counter to people engaging into that area. Who doesn't want that? That's fucking sick. So wait, you've got this area control unit and I can dodge some of its shots, but even if I dodge its shots, it can have soft control over an area, right? That punishes me for going into it. Isn't that sick? Like the Atlas has all of these weaknesses as a unit. It has to be sieged. It has to acquire a target. It's possible for the target to even miss. Why wouldn't you want the upgrade to just come online a bit faster? Yeah, of course, ha ha ha. Yes, of course. Also, I said before that I want a plus 15% buff to splash damage. I want the Atlas to have plus 20%. And the biggest reason that I want it to have plus 20% is that it goes from 80 to 96 here, right? And the biggest reason that I want to go from 80 to 96 is that if you do only plus 12, it gets to 92. It doesn't kill as many units in 2 shots as it does if it does 96. Yeah, and I'm perfectly okay with that, Frank. It also, by the way, does insane damage to exos and makes their life miserable and is really good against workers. And the thing that's fine with that is, again, if you have powerful, again, all of these units, I know it looks crazy because I only put numbers for the Atlas to show what its plus 20% is, but the Saber's getting plus 15% splash. The Hellborn is also getting plus 15% splash. The reason I think that this is all cool is that more AoE damage encourages people to do what we're seeing in IVI. You know why people don't just group up and have a big dumb fight in IVI as often at good levels of play? It's because the Magmadon will shit on any number of gaunts, right? Like, that's totally fine. Yeah, I mean, I disagree. It's just the short of it, right? It is okay that a unit that has a wind-up to do this, right, that you can dodge, does do one-shot, because we have other things that one-shot as well, right? And also, are gaunts actually that satisfying as a tier 1.5 unit, right? You can also just use this for Hellborn, right? Like, I know Hellborn aren't tier 2 in the same way, but you're also getting plus damage against them that's kind of wrecking through and cleaving through Exos because they didn't get any health changes. You know, it might feel hard to dodge, but you kind of have to have these strong AoE, and the strong AoE encourages, like haha is saying, multi-pronged harass. Like, you kind of have to eat the L, take the loss that some units are going to die in a way that feels frustrating or unsatisfying. Like, we just added 2 seconds to the inflamed imp's ability to run up and hit you for 100 damage! 100 damage for a thing that's just a transformation off a 25 Therium from a unit that you have an abundance of anyways. Like, it's good to have that, basically. I mean, you just get more harassment because the biggest reason to have AoE, like you're seeing explicitly here with the Atlas, but is more true for the other items that we talked about, right? Like the Magmadon is a good example that's got like some shadow buffs that'll really help it in relationship to all these other units, right? Is that actually more AoE just means, guess what? AoE tends to find its way to worker lines. AoE tends to find its way to damaging enemies. And here's what's cool about this. I went all the way here. I'm just going to go very quickly up to the concepts at the top, right? More AoE is more defensible bases. But the easier it is for you to defend your small number of bases, the more you're encouraged to spread out, because you might be able to defend all of your bases. And then the more reason to spread out, the better harassment gets, the more micro is rewarded, the more multi-pronging is rewarded. And if it feels that bad, then we can come back to it, but I would rather live in a world where something cool happens than watch this unit basically not get made, right? Okay, now we get to the evac. These are all just flying things, basically. So, evac, remove heavy tag. Between removing the heavy tag and taking its health, going it from 250 to 300, right? The evac is supposed to be the faster transport unit than the Doombringer, right? You can tell by the fact that it has an upgrade that gives it bonus speed. So the fact that it had return to hanger on it was already pretty insane. Removing the heavy tag means that not as much bonus damage gets applied to it by Shadow Flyers, and the specific value here of health from 250 to 300 is meant for and the specific change here for the health from 250 to 300 means that actually 3 Shadow Flyers don't kill, but 4 do. The reason this is important is that you get, for anyone who doesn't play Infernal, you get 2 Shadow Flyers every time that you generate the Shadow Flyer unit. You get them in pairs. And so one evac still dies to the same number, quote, one evac still dies to the same number of charges of Shadow Flyers, right? But 2 evacs don't, and that's kind of the benefit that we're looking at here. This is not talking about changing the mine that was on the Hornet, then the evac, then the Hornet, then the evac, then flipping, flopping. We're not doing any of that, right? Yep. Air quotes. So, now, we're going to get to now, here's the thing again. It's possible through the Super Shroud Stone that the evac is still not going to land, still not do anything, but that's more of a problem with the Super Shroud Stone in Infernal's top bar. And the problem with that is that I don't really want to fix that, because again, this is trying as hard as possible to be balance changes. And the reason balance changes are a good idea is that I hope it requires less effort from the developers to implement balance, as in change the number of a thing that already exists, than it does design, which is, well, I don't like the Super Shroud Stone. Why don't you make it that, like, a meteor falls from the ground and it summons, like, a totem, and the totem is like an anti-air fly? Like, that's nonsense, dude. This is going to take so much time for the developers to make, whereas the goal of a patch for balance is, like, number go burr. And, okay, so I can't really do that with the Super Shroud Stone. So, if this doesn't, but this also might mean that evacs get a little bit more done in Vanguard v Vanguard. Although I'm doubtful because of the next change, Hornets. Damage from 13 plus 4. Here, let's just write that. So the damage is, the damage goes from 13 plus 4 versus light. Here we go, and we'll highlight it, to 13 plus 8 versus light. For anyone who doesn't know, the Hornet previously did 13 plus 13 versus light, and the problem with that is that means that it was 4-shotting or 5-shotting worker units, and it was very oppressive. And it was not only oppressive against Infernal, it was actually pretty oppressive. It was pretty oppressive, actually, against Celestial. Celestials didn't really have a good way of dealing with it, but I think with the Scythe buffs, they'll have more of an idea of how to deal with it. Also, I didn't make any changes to the Seraphim, and actually the meta has kind of run away from Seraphim, the anti-creep unit that the Celestials are building, so I don't think that this goes too hard. The reason it's 13 plus 8 is that 13 plus 8 gets to 20 damage after 1 tick of Veil, 1 tick of Shroud regeneration for an Infernal Imps, right? So you don't feel like a unit is left with a pittance of hit points, you just missed that last 1 shot. That's not very satisfying. It also means that you get a nice clean number to cleave over other workers whose health is in multiples of 20 and has tended and trended towards being in multiples of 20, right? Now to say, Hornet, movement speed. Going to increase its movement speed to 5.5. For anyone who doesn't know, the Hornet has an ability. So remember, we took away the ability for the Hornet to just return to hangar and get out of jail free. The Hornet has a passive ability where I believe after 5 seconds of not interacting or not firing, not dealing damage, it goes ahead and gains movement speed. This means that they're slower than Scythes. This means that they're still slower than Shadow Flyers. That was something that I fought very hard for, and I think that's very important. But I think that this gives them just a little more counterplay. The minorest of minor buffs to movement speed, because you really want to be careful with movement speed. Like, you could definitely fuck up and make a unit too good because of movement speed, because of its micro ability. Wait, why is the... I did not put the Sentinel here. I did put the Sentinel here. The Sentinel's got bonus hit points now. I believe it went from 200 hit points to 250. The biggest reason here is that the Sentinel is one of those units. I personally, up to me, I would remove the auto attack from the Sentinel. I think the auto attack of the Sentinel exists for the same reason that High Templar and StarCraft 2 have an auto attack. It's to make it so that when you A-move your army, the spellcaster that you should be paying one of the most critical amounts of attention to doesn't and just go to the front lines and get evaporated. I think that's a skill issue, but I know there's a lot of people who are not a big fan of doing that. I personally, it's not in the patch notes, but I would do that, right? Up to me, remove the auto attack from the Sentinel, just let units die if they're miscontrolled. But, that's not up there, and so return to hit point, the return to base has been nerfed, and so this thing gets 50 hit points to compensate. Units are supposed to die. That's the point of playing an RTS where all the units live. It's called They Are Billions, if you wanted to play an RTS where all of your units live, but only if you do it well. There are other games like, if you're watching a really good Warcraft 3 match, you can watch an RTS where a lot of units live that you don't think should be able to live on critically low health. And that's pretty satisfying in its own way. But this is more, when they say Blizzard style, it's pretty obvious that they're leaning more towards the StarCraft sensibilities, or were able to capture more of the StarCraft user base, install base, than they were of the Warcraft 3 install base. Helicarrier hit points from 500 to 600. Again, this is pretty massive. This is a 20% increase in the hit points of the Helicarrier, because a lot of the times they have to run anyone who doesn't know, they'll walk up to do their bombing run, and then they have to pull back away, so the range is not quite as far as the bombing run can actually hit, so controlling that can be a bit of a nightmare. And so I didn't really want to futz around with the bombing run. Even though I'm a big AoE fan, I actually think that the AoE that the Helicarriers do is totally fine. I would like to see a bit more of it. I know that there are Infernal players who please God, no, get us out of that nightmare. And the thing is that they have some better tools to deal with it, but not really. Yes, the Hellborn can hit air, but it can't really hit air at the range of a well-controlled group of Helicarriers. It also was pretty toxic to see that you could just group Vanguard units together in such a way that it was never ever going to happen, especially because there are top bar abilities for Vanguard like the shield and like promote, where if it does look like for some travesty that the Helicarrier might actually die to cost efficient Shadow Flyers or something like that from the Infernal player, whoops, there's a bar. Just going to make sure that that doesn't happen anymore. My bad, guys. So I think giving it bonus hit points there is the right idea, as opposed to it just makes it a little more survivable, but Vanguard units are already pretty survivable. It doesn't make sense to give it more armor. It doesn't make sense to give it more health. Maybe you could argue that giving it more armor might make it more interesting relative to what its value is, but it's just easier to just give the thing health and then be more careful with armor going forward. And then Graven. Revert the 0.2.0 damage nerf. The reason that I want this is that I actually so there were two options here. One is give it back the sticky bomb damage, and the other option was to give it back, one was to give it back the sticky bomb damage, and the other option was to give it back, not that, but to give it the, its bonus damage versus light. Here's the problem with giving it its sticky bomb damage back, is that I still think it's really good. And the Raven's one of those units. Here's where you have to be careful with tier 3 units, which is why the Hellborn didn't get massive touches either. Tier 3 units tend to be giga fucking broken in RTS games when the game first comes out. It's just that the player base doesn't realize it yet. And I'm not saying I know better than every pro player, community caster, things like that. What I'm saying is this: if the state of the game and the balance in the gameplay is such that people aren't hitting critical masses of tier 3 units, you escape the opportunity to find out whether tier 3 is broken, right? I think that what happened to the Gravens for its sticky bomb nerf is actually like what IMLS from League of Legends calls a placebo nerf. And what I mean by that is that it did get nerfed. It is worse now than it used to be, but all that does is really make people feel like the problem has been taken care of. I don't actually think that the problem has been taken care of. I think it's very good AoE. I think there's good reason to use it. And I think that as you see the game get later and later, you're going to see people play more with the Graven. They're going to see the value of it. Yeah, David Kim said so many times players always take longer to learn how to defend against abilities than they do to learn how to attack with those same abilities. Yes. Yes, absolutely the case. Absolutely. And so here's the thing with the Graven, though. I am not opposed to the Graven getting back its damage versus light units. I think that there's a lot of micro and control and possibilities with Gravens. And we actually, when Gravens were meta in Vanguard versus sometimes Vanguard versus Celestials, when they were dealing with the most broken vector shit I've ever seen in my life. I could not conceive of a more broken unit than that vector. But give me a month, maybe I can. And when they were dealing with Mass Vector in that way, right, Graven saw their sunlight, and then they also saw it in IVV versus Vanguard or versus Infernal, and you got VVI, and you got to see Infernal players just like, well, there's a sticky bomb in one of my gaunts. Two of them overlapping. There's literally no time to move things out of the way before they all explode in a sticky goo. Here's the thing, though. We also got to see players who were good at the teleport, people who were good at the invisibility, people who were good at handling detection or not. This is a very skill-expressive unit to see out and about and played with, right? And it gives, again, importantly, it gives the players something to fucking do with their hands, dude. Give them something to do with their hands. You know why in League of Legends, I've used this example before, you know why there's like community casters and there's people who run events, there's tournament organizers and there's the analysts of teams, and they'll all say, like for many, many years in League of Legends, probably don't pick Renekton. Not just IMLS, there's like other people who say this as well, as like, just don't pick the Croc. It's not very good. And for anyone who plays League of Legends, you know if you've ever played top lane with Renekton, why they pick the Croc. Because it's got buttons, dude. It's got 2 dashes. It's got a stun. It has an empowered Q that you can do to like clear and to trade. It has like really cool sub interactions. You get to do the thing. And I want people to be able to play the game and do the thing. So I think that the Graven having more of its basic damage is fine. You want to risk this high tier, high Therium unit with a lot of skill expression and you want to fucking possibly die just trying to chase after a Weaver? Go for it, dude. That seems sick. Definitely want more stuff like that. All right, now you might think that we're done. You should know that we're never done. Hi, Dronimus. It's been a while, man. Okay, so we're going to get to creep. I'm a creep. What the hell am I doing here? This don't belong here. Okay, listen, I'm going to make a video at some point. It depends. I'll have to, knowing me, I'll have to experience something that pisses me off enough, and then I'll just make the like Itano's take on creep. But we're not going to do that yet. All you need to know is if this were a design patch, like a redesign, I'm putting creep in the bin, I'm taking something out of the toy box, and we're trying again. But this is a balance patch. This is trying to change numbers as best as possible using systems I think are either nowhere in the game or might be reasonable to assume are in the game, right? Things like even minor redesigns like remove the ability is just, hey, don't attach this ability to this unit, right? Just unattach it. So here's creep's balance supposition, okay? Not all creeps exist on map start, and here's why. There's been a lot of talk about how the game, generated by myself, Rail, Ciclempe, some other people, Audio Circ, about whether or not the game should be casual friendly or more esports friendly or more like pro scene oriented or all these things. I'm going to argue that the way that the creeps are distributed on the map right now is terrible for everybody. So it's terrible for the casual player because if they don't know the matchup is supposed to go a certain way, they're just going to see all these creeps getting captured by their opponent in Infernal versus Celestial. They're not going to know that it's supposed to happen that way as a matchup dependent item, right? So they have all of this ability to see the map and they see all these creeps they could reach out to. They don't know which ones they're supposed to go to. They don't know what the route is supposed to do. Yes, normally it's the health camp into the vision camp. Sometimes it's the health camp into the speed camp. Sometimes it's the speed camp into the health camp. Sometimes you ignore the vision because it's too far off the side and it's not worth getting actually. And all of these things create so many options that you would think all of these options would create interesting skill metrics to show the strong players and their power and their ability and their competence, but all it really shows is the difference between people who know what an optimal route or an optimized route looks like, not necessarily optimal at the top of the tier, but like optimized, like, maybe not the best, but has a lot of thought generated towards it. It just shows, hey, do you know what optimized creep routes look like in January 17th, 2025? Oh, you don't? Okay, I just wreck you with that knowledge, actually, because everything you do is late and it affects your economy and you're just borked. And if you do know that, you just do it. And then you're fine. And it's like, so wait, there's a huge host of false options for any casual to intermediate player. And then any strong player just knows, like, oh, well, they just really messed up there. And so the idea here is not all creeps exist on map start, and you spawn them in waves, and the waves are defined somewhat arbitrarily by me, somewhat by armor type, as there was an intelligent discussion made recently about how the matchup for Celestial versus Infernal really seems to depend on the number of light camps that exist on a map, with people noting that Ruination, for instance, seems pretty good for Celestial. Now, so here's the suggestion. Light wave 1, like Shadow Demons and the Slimes, health and speed camp at 2:30. This doesn't, by the way, all these changes to the numbers, I'm open to changing the minute second timer that happens here. The reason that you do this is that you give some possibility that players can math out a build that makes it possible for them to contest some of these. And you make all of these spawn around the entire map. So let's say that you've got a really big 4-player map, all of the health and speed camps are going to spawn at this time. Do you show up at your own? Do you show up at your enemies? These are decision points that are actually meaningful and can impact the game, as opposed to just being a battle of whether or not it's optimized. You have this degree of safety versus risk then. Medium wave, I just call medium the oozes and the Shadow Demon's vision camp. Right, Shadow Mastiffs for the speed camp, by the way. At 4 minutes, at 5:30, it's the Luminite and Therium, and then at Siege Wave 1, 7 minutes, is the Siege camp. The reason that you do all of this is that you actually make it so that it's more likely, can't guarantee it, makes it more likely through pure balance that you have all factions have some ability to contend with needing to take that map objective. Now, here's the thing, that is going to make the start of the game a little bit slower, because you're not going to have access to, I'm just going to use a Morph Core and Sovereign's Watch and tank with the building, and I'm just going to power rank, and I'm just going to go take the health camp at the 1 minute 5 second mark, or the 34 second mark, or I'm just going to use my first Lancer or my Scout, and I'm going to go wreck this health camp over here, or I'm going to go as Infernal, I'm going to go one conk, one vault, one conk, and I'm just going to go use my Hexen in my first brute or so, and we're just going to go Shrektify the speed camp so that we can use that. That is inherently not as interesting and doesn't speed up the game as much. If you think the game needs to be sped up, there's a reason Jex actually said, for anyone who wasn't in the Discord, that the keyword for the patch was economy. So I did not touch on the economy here, but just aside from what's written here, again, just my off-the-dome, off-the-cuff thoughts, if you really want the economy to be faster, then increase the increases that you get, or increase the amount that you get from Luminite, and increase the amount that you get from Therium, or start players with more, or increase the returns that they get every time that they mine. You could do something else for the economy, then depend on creeps, which, by the way, seem to, my suggestion, seem to be failing in their obligation towards this idea of, an interesting choice between expanding or creeping. Right now, it doesn't seem to be accomplishing that goal, and I don't know even if this will accomplish that goal, but it might make it so that the points of map contention, the other thing that creeps are supposed to do, provide map contention points, some way for armies to battle over something that is of value, maybe mimic some of the creep jacking you see in Warcraft 3. If they spawn at discrete increments that aren't all start at the beginning of the game, then it makes the snowball not as fast for the winning player, and it makes it possible for the defending player to have more choices matchup dependently. All right, so we're going to see another thing over here. We're going to get to the last two items. Now, these are the things that are going to be a bit harder to do, because again, I'm not sure that they have the ability to spawn camps after a certain amount of time. But there's obviously a part that comes with this. There's no tension between expanding and creeping, because one uses resources and one uses army. Yeah, exactly. It's like playing a Euro game. One of my favorite Euro games to dislike is called Above and Below. And the reason I don't like Above and Below, for anyone who is like a Euro gamer board game geek and knows what this game is that basically it is a city builder on the top, like that's the above, and then below talks about dungeon diving and getting resources and treasure. But actually, I call it above and above, and you can guess why. It's because the systematic building that happens in the above ground portion of above and below is so good that you can actually just win the game by doing that competently and never doing the delving or going down. And something similar is happening with the tension between expanding and creeping. The tension between expanding and creeping is one of us knows which one the other is supposed to do. Does the other one know that as well? They don't actually, it's like an above and above versus below and below scenario. They're not contending with one another in the same way. Now, these are going to require the most design changes. If you think that in fact a design change is needed for this and it's not already something that exists inside of the editor, inside of their map making tools, etc. Camps spawn after XX seconds from death. Now, we already know that that happens, but I suggest that it be something that happens universally. Someone asked me the question, do you think there should be timers on it? Like, it should just show you, oh, in 59 seconds, the medium, the energy and vision camps will respawn? No, that's part of the skill of the game is memorizing when these things spawn. I even think the fact that you can see through the fog of war, as you see below here, and the fact that you can see the timer on the camps themselves if you click the tower. I bet you didn't know that, more casual players. If you click the tower that indicates the possession of that given tower, of that given camp, you can actually go ahead and access how long it is until that respawns, right? Now, how boring is that? Like, so I have to know, this is what I'm talking about, where if the game isn't made towards more skill expressive means, then the intelligence and the outplay potential comes from subsystems that are become increasingly ornery and deep in the weeds, right? Oh, you didn't know you have to click the tower so you can see a bar that indicates how long it is until the thing respawns? Now you know. But I actually think that knowing the timer like in your head is perfectly fine, and that's fine that that's part of, hitting sharp timings is good in RTS games. If you want creep camps to matter in this way and you don't want to redesign them, which I may suggest you should do, then go ahead and make it so that players have to just memorize the timer. But here's the other thing, don't show creep camp status through the fog of war. There are people who are 2200 plus that weren't on any conversation with me ever publicly. You don't know that I know them, right? You don't know what my history is with them, and they just tell me, oh yeah, I can tell what the build order is of my opponent depending on our matchup based on the timing that they take of their various creep camps. Like, they just know. They just know that actually on this timing, that means that they did this build, and then on this map, oh, they did that. Well, that's going to get them killed because they shouldn't have done that because this map is optimized towards X. So for like casual newer players, this extra information doesn't help them. They're not looking at the minimap. For intermediate players, right, like, yeah, exactly. For intermediate players, the creep camp is just showing them, it's showing them information, but they don't know how to parse the information, and they're not checking the minimap actively enough to understand it. But for people who have macro cycle check, who can macro cycle, not paying attention like this, just zooming off screen, not paying attention to the screen, not looking at anything else, doing everything else automatically, and they're skull staring over here at the minimap, they know that information, and it just makes the game incredibly boring that they know all the information their opponent is doing based on that. And you could say, oh, but what about, hiding the information by faking a build, by getting it slower than they could normally? Well, creeps give economy, and the faster you get your economy going, the faster you can ramp up. So it's actually not worth the 14 seconds of time to fool your opponent into thinking you're doing a build that you're not, just for the sake of tricking them, because then you're possibly 14 seconds off of a big spike on your Luminite and Therium. So this was in fact not short, and I do think it's now physically impossible for me to make any video in which I explain my thoughts that's under an hour and a half. But I hope that you find this interesting. When this gets to YouTube, which it will, and when this gets over to any other platforms like Twitter, Reddit, other socials, I will try and post all of the items that are listed here underneath so you can understand, have some context. As usual, I try and provide timestamps so you can click around and follow through whatever you think is interesting. And also, if there's anyone who wants to message me offline about any of these items, you'll have some context, not only beyond what the patch notes are, but whatever my ideas are oriented around it. So again, this is Itano patch notes of Autocasts and AoE. This is basically what I would do if for some reason someone had slipped on a banana peel, conked their head on concrete, and gave me the ability to be in charge of balance for one patch. I really think that removing autocast increases the skill expression of the game. I think it gives you an opportunity to go ahead and increase the differences between people and players and let it be shown. I think increasing AoE will have the effect at first of making the game more stultifying and boring, but shortly, and I mean in a matter of weeks, if less, after that, people will realize that this increased defensive prowess will allow them to go ahead and do amazing things in terms of defending a lot of space with few units, and that'll make more of the RTS triangle that we love and know and care about show up. We'll see more greed, we'll see more harass, we'll see more standard builds that are meant to be not just the only build on a faction by faction or on a on a faction by faction basis, on a matchup basis, but maybe one of many builds. And these are kind of the hopes that I have, and what I would love to see, given that we're going to have a new patch pretty soon.